Servants should pour coffee, not understand contracts. The words were spoken in Arabic, low and casual, like they weren't meant to be heard by anyone who mattered. But Naomi Carter heard every syllable. Her hand stopped mid-pour, the dark stream of coffee freezing in the air for half a breath before settling into the porcelain cup with a soft tap. Around the 48th floor boardroom, nobody noticed at first. Why would they? To them, she was just another hotel waitress in a pressed black uniform, moving silently between billionaires and executives like part of the furniture. The room smelled of dark roast coffee, polished oak, and expensive cologne. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Manhattan skyline in sharp afternoon light, the Hudson glinting like broken glass far below. At the center of the table sat Richard Whitmore, one of the most feared investors on Wall Street, his silver pen poised above a contract thick enough to reshape industries. $900 million. That was the number sitting on the table. A deal so massive it had brought half the city's financial elite into one room. To Richard's right sat Ethan Blake, his sharp-jawed executive partner, leaning back in his leather chair with the lazy confidence of a man who believed money made him untouchable. Ethan smirked as he whispered the insult, his cufflinks catching the sunlight like tiny knives. He didn't even glance at Naomi. To him, she was invisible. Naomi lowered the coffee pot slowly, her fingers steady, her face unreadable. But inside, her pulse hit hard against her ribs. Not because of the insult. She'd heard worse. It was what came after. Ethan kept speaking in Arabic, assuming the language wrapped his words in privacy. Once he signs, we control the board. He'll never see it coming. Naomi's stomach tightened. Her eyes flicked toward the open contract in front of Richard. A single highlighted clause near the bottom of page 19. She recognized the structure instantly. Not because she was curious. Because she had spent 3 years in Dubai analyzing risk exposure for multinational mergers before life collapsed into hospital bills, debt collectors, and this uniform. Richard adjusted his tie and looked at Ethan. Everything clean? He asked. Ethan smiled. Clean as glass. Naomi felt the weight of the room press against her. Crystal chandeliers hummed faintly above them. The air conditioning whispered through hidden vents. Outside, a helicopter drifted over the river, distant and small. Time seemed to stretch thin. She could walk away. Pour the coffee. Keep her head down. Finish her shift. That was what invisible people did. But then Ethan laughed again in Arabic. Sign it. The servant doesn't know she's carrying your ruin. Naomi set the silver tray down on the marble side table with a soft click that cut through the room like a blade. Every head turned. Ethan's smile faltered. Richard looked up, annoyed at the interruption. Naomi lifted her chin, her voice calm, sharp, and unmistakably fluent as she answered in Arabic. A servant knows exactly when a man is being robbed. The room went silent. Richard's pen stopped moving. Ethan's face lost color. And for the first time that afternoon, Naomi Carter was no longer invisible. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the boardroom moved. The silence felt heavy, like the kind that settles before a storm breaks. Richard Whitmore kept his silver pen hovering over the signature line, his fingers frozen in place. Across the polished oak table, Ethan Blake stared at Naomi Carter like the floor had shifted beneath him. His usual confidence cracked at the edges, his mouth slightly open, his eyes narrowing as if trying to understand how a hotel waitress had answered him in flawless Arabic. Naomi stood beside the marble service station, shoulders straight, hands calm at her sides, but her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. This was not supposed to happen. Not for someone like her. Not in rooms like this. Richard leaned back slowly, the leather of his chair creaking beneath him. His sharp gray eyes locked onto Naomi. Where did you learn that? He asked, his voice low and measured. Naomi swallowed once, keeping her breath steady. Cairo first, she said. Then Dubai. The room shifted. A few executives exchanged glances, confused. One man near the far end of the table adjusted his glasses, looking at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Ethan gave a short, nervous laugh. She is bluffing, he said, forcing his voice into calm. Probably memorized a phrase or two. But Naomi looked directly at him and answered in Arabic again, her words clean and precise. The indemnity clause on page 19 gives your holding company full exit protection while shifting all legal liability to his firm. Ethan's jaw tightened. Richard's eyes dropped to the contract. His fingers moved to page 19, flipping paper slowly, each turn loud in the silence. Naomi watched him, her mind racing backward, years peeling away like old wallpaper. Before the uniform, before the trays and polished glasses, before New York, there had been conference rooms in Dubai. Real ones? Bigger than this. Louder than this. Naomi had once sat on the other side of tables like these, wearing tailored blazers, analyzing mergers worth billions for Al Noor Capital, one of the largest risk consulting firms in the Gulf. At 27, she had been one of the youngest senior analysts in the company, fluent in 3 languages and trusted to catch what others missed. But life had changed in one phone call. Her mother's diagnosis. Stage 3 lymphoma. Naomi left everything behind, flew home, burned through her savings on treatment, and when the money disappeared, so did the job offers. 3 years out of finance became too long for Wall Street to forgive. And when employers saw the gap, they stopped asking what she knew. They only asked where she had been. Hotel work paid fast. Bills did not wait for pride. Richard stopped turning pages. His finger landed on the clause Naomi mentioned. He read once. Then twice. His face hardened. Ethan shifted in his chair. Richard, he started, forcing a smile. It is standard language. Naomi spoke before Richard could answer. No, it is not. Her voice stayed calm, but sharp enough to cut through the room. Standard language protects both sides. That clause protects only him. She nodded toward Ethan. Richard looked up slowly, the city light reflecting cold in his eyes now. The room no longer felt like a boardroom. It felt like a courtroom. And Naomi Carter was no longer serving coffee. She was exposing something far more expensive than pride. Richard Whitmore did not speak right away. He just stared at page 19, his thumb holding the corner of the contract like it suddenly weighed 50 pounds. The sunlight pouring through the glass walls had shifted lower now, stretching long bars of gold across the table, cutting through the silence like blades. Around him, the executives sat still, their expensive watches glinting, their polished shoes motionless against the dark wood floor. Nobody reached for coffee anymore. Nobody checked their phones. The deal had stopped breathing. Ethan Blake leaned forward first, forcing a tight smile, the kind men wear when panic starts pressing against their ribs. Richard, this is unnecessary, he said, sliding his hand toward the contract. We have spent 6 months building this acquisition. Every attorney reviewed it. Richard lifted his hand, stopping him without looking up. A small motion, but sharp enough to freeze the room again. Naomi stayed where she was, beside the service table, feeling every eye in the room on her. She knew what came next. Doubt. Questions. Pressure. That was how rooms like this protected power. Richard read the clause a third time, slower now. His jaw tightened. Section 19.4. He said quietly. Full litigation transfer. Ethan cleared his throat. Only in the event of regulatory conflict. Naomi spoke carefully. No, sir. Read the final sentence. Richard's eyes moved lower. His expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. The kind of change only sharp people noticed. A slight tightening around the eyes. A breath held too long. He looked up at Ethan. This gives me all downstream liability. Ethan spread his hands. Temporary liability. That is normal. Naomi shook her head. Not temporary. Her voice was steady now, stronger. Permanent. It transfers every unresolved legal dispute attached to your overseas holdings. If there is fraud, unpaid debt, or government investigation, your company absorbs all of it. A man at the far end of the table, one of Richard's attorneys, reached for the contract and scanned the clause himself. His face turned pale. She is right. The words landed hard. Ethan looked at him sharply. Excuse me? The attorney adjusted his glasses, his voice dry. The wording is layered under cross-jurisdiction compliance terms. But yes. Liability stays with Whitmore Capital. Richard slowly closed the contract. The sound echoed through the room like a door shutting. Ethan's polished calm began slipping. A bead of sweat traced down beside his temple. Richard, listen to me, he said. This is standard overseas structuring. We can amend it later. Richard leaned back, his eyes cold now. Later? He asked. After my name is tied to your unresolved cases? Ethan's voice hardened. Do not let a waitress derail $900 million. Naomi felt the insult hit the room harder than it hit her. Richard looked at her. Really looked at her now. Not the uniform. Not the tray. Her. What did you do in Dubai? He asked. Naomi hesitated, then answered. Risk analysis. Mergers. International compliance. Richard's eyebrows lifted slightly. And now? Naomi glanced down at her uniform. Now I serve coffee. The room stayed silent. But something had changed. The weight of status had cracked. Richard tapped the contract once with his finger. Funny, he said, staring at Ethan. Because the only person in this room who protected my company today was the woman serving coffee. Ethan's face tightened. Outside the windows, the city kept moving. Yellow cabs below. Ferries cutting across the river. But inside that room, the balance of power had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The room did not recover from Richard's words. They hung in the air like cold steel, sharp and undeniable. Ethan Blake sat frozen for half a second, then straightened his tie and forced himself back into control. Men like Ethan did not panic in public. They redirected. Reframed. Reclaimed. He leaned forward, folding his hands on the polished table, his voice smooth again. Richard, do not do this over a misunderstanding, he said. One clause does not erase 6 months of negotiation. Richard said nothing. His eyes stayed on the contract. Naomi could hear the quiet hum of the ventilation above them, the faint rattle of ice melting in untouched water glasses. Every sound felt louder now. The room had shifted into dangerous territory, and everyone knew it. One wrong sentence could break everything. Ethan turned toward Naomi, his stare sharper now, colder. Tell me, he said, his voice carrying a thin edge, how does a hotel waitress suddenly become an expert on billion-dollar acquisitions? Naomi felt the question land like a trap. Not because she could not answer it. Because she knew exactly why he asked. Not for truth. For doubt. To shrink her back into the role he preferred. A server. Invisible. Replaceable. She kept her hands folded in front of her apron, her posture steady. Because I used to build them, she said. The answer cut through the room. A few executives exchanged glances. One of the younger analysts shifted in his seat, clearly trying to connect the woman who poured coffee with the language of risk transfer and legal exposure. Ethan let out a dry laugh. And now you carry trays. Naomi nodded once. Life changes. Richard looked at her, studying her face with new attention. Not suspicion now. Calculation. Respect, maybe? But Ethan was not finished. He opened his leather folder and slid a stack of papers across the table toward Richard. Look at the valuation sheet, he said quickly. Revenue projections, market expansion, offshore tax relief. This deal triples your international position within 18 months. Richard glanced at the papers but did not touch them. Naomi recognized the tactic immediately. Flood the table with numbers. Bury the problem under opportunity. Classic pressure strategy. Her eyes caught something else. A footnote. Small print. Hidden beneath projected earnings. Her breath slowed. There it was. Another trap. Different shape. Same intent. Naomi stepped forward before she could stop herself. The Cyprus subsidiary, she said. Ethan snapped his head toward her. What? Naomi pointed toward the valuation sheet. Page 6. Bottom note. The subsidiary is under audit. Richard grabbed the page and scanned it. Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Enough, he said louder. This time. She has no place in this meeting. But Richard kept reading. His attorney reached over and looked too. His face tightened immediately. Richard, the attorney said carefully, if the subsidiary fails audit, projected assets drop by almost 40%. The room shifted again, this time harder. Richard slowly set the papers down. 2 hidden liabilities. 2 separate traps. Both found by the same woman holding a coffee towel. Ethan's polished image began cracking in real time. The calm in his eyes disappeared, replaced by something sharper. Desperation. Richard stood from his chair, 6 feet of tailored precision and cold authority. The city light hit the side of his face, turning half of it into shadow. He looked at Ethan, then at Naomi, then back at the papers. How much was I about to lose? He asked. His attorney answered first. Best case? 400 million. He paused. Worst case? Everything tied to the merger. Richard exhaled once, slow and controlled. Naomi could feel the tension pulling tight across the room like wire. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because everyone understood now. This was no misunderstanding. This was exposure. And Naomi Carter had just stopped it before the ink touched paper. Richard Whitmore stayed standing, one hand pressed against the edge of the conference table, his knuckles pale against the dark polished wood. The contract lay open in front of him like evidence in a trial. Nobody in the room looked comfortable anymore. The temperature had not changed, but the air felt colder, heavier, like all the oxygen had been replaced by tension. Ethan Blake rose slowly from his chair, smoothing his jacket with controlled hands, trying to gather what little authority he still had left. Richard, he said carefully, his voice lower now, measured. You are making a mistake by trusting her analysis over mine. Richard looked at him without expression. My analysis? Naomi said before she could stop herself. Ethan turned sharply toward her, and for the first time, the polished smile was gone. You should remember where you are, he said. His voice was calm, but there was heat beneath it now. This is not your world. Naomi felt. Every eye moved back to her. The room was waiting to see if she would shrink. That was what people like Ethan expected. Silence from people they had already judged. But Naomi had spent too many years being overlooked to fear it now. No, she said quietly. It used to be my world. Ethan stepped closer to the table, his fingertips pressing against the leather folder. Used to be, he repeated, almost laughing. And now you serve coffee in a hotel lobby. There is a reason for that. The insult was cleaner this time. Sharper because it carried truth twisted into judgment. Naomi felt it hit her chest, but she did not let it show. She thought of hospital rooms. Plastic chairs beside her mother's bed. Bills stacked on kitchen counters. Job interviews where executives looked at her resume and saw absence instead of sacrifice. Richard watched her closely, and for the first time he saw something beyond confidence. He saw cost. Ethan turned to the room, trying to reclaim it. She walked away from finance, he said. She is out of the game. Outdated. Irrelevant. Naomi lifted her eyes to him. Risk does not change, she said. Only the people willing to ignore it. Richard's attorney cleared his throat. Richard, the audit issue alone should stop this deal until we investigate. Ethan snapped toward him. The audit is procedural. Procedural? Naomi said. Her voice stayed calm, but stronger now. Cyprus froze 3 firms last year over compliance fraud. If your subsidiary is connected, that exposure becomes his. She looked directly at Richard. Your name. Your company. Your liability. Richard's fingers tightened against the table. The city outside was turning orange now, sunset washing the glass walls and gold and fire. Inside, the room felt still enough to hear breathing. Ethan looked around and realized it. He was losing them. The attorneys. The analysts. Even the board members. Doubt had spread. And doubt kills deals faster than numbers. He straightened his shoulders and looked at Richard one last time. If you walk away now, Ethan said, you lose market position, investor confidence, and 6 months of work. Richard looked down at the contract, then at the valuation sheet, then at Naomi standing in a black service uniform beside a silver coffee tray. The contrast was almost absurd. Yet the most valuable voice in the room had come from the person nobody respected when she walked in. Richard picked up his pen. Ethan's eyes flashed with relief for half a second. Then Richard snapped the pen in half and dropped it on the table. The crack of plastic echoed through the room like a gunshot of finality. This meeting is over, Richard said. Ethan's face strained of color. The deal was dead. $900 million vanished in one sentence. And Naomi Carter stood in the silence, her apron still on, her hands still steady, knowing that for the second time in her life, truth had cost her comfort, but saved someone else everything. The boardroom emptied in silence, but it was not the ordinary silence of business ending. It was the kind that followed collapse, when everyone walked out carrying the weight of what almost happened. Chairs slid back softly. Leather briefcases snapped shut. Shoes tapped across polished hardwood with careful urgency. Nobody looked at Ethan Blake as they left. That was the first sign of real damage. In rooms like this, isolation came before consequences. Naomi Carter stayed behind for a moment, gathering untouched coffee cups from the table. The steam was gone now. Cold coffee. Half-full glasses of water. Crumpled legal notes. The remains of a deal that had nearly changed everything for the wrong reasons. Her hands moved automatically, trained by routine, but her thoughts were louder than the room. She should not have spoken. Not because she was wrong. Because speaking always changed things. It always cost something. Through the glass wall, Manhattan glowed under the fading sunset, the buildings painted gold and amber, the river below moving dark and slow like oil under light. Naomi carried the tray toward the service hallway, her shoes soft against marble flooring, her reflection following her in the glass panels like a shadow she could not escape. The hallway behind the executive floor was colder, quieter, stripped of luxury. Stainless steel counters. Rolling carts. White tile. The smell of soap and fresh linen. Real life. Her life. She set the tray down beside the industrial sink and leaned both hands against the metal counter, finally letting out the breath she had been holding for the last 20 minutes. Her fingers trembled now. Not from fear. From release. Naomi? The voice came from behind her. It was Linda Morales, the evening floor supervisor, holding a clipboard against her chest. Linda looked worried. What happened up there? Naomi shook her head lightly. A meeting ended. Linda frowned. Security is talking. They said the investor canceled everything. Naomi gave a tired smile. Looks like it. Linda stepped closer, lowering her voice. Was it because of you? Naomi looked down at the silver tray, seeing her reflection in the polished surface. Tired eyes. Hair pulled tight. A uniform that still smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner. Maybe, she said. Linda stared for a moment, then shook her head. Girl, you have been here 8 months, and I still do not know your whole story. Naomi almost laughed, but it stayed caught in her throat. Because the truth was simple. People rarely asked. They saw the uniform and decided the rest for themselves. Outside the small kitchen window, rain had started falling, light and steady against the glass. New York rain. Soft at first, then constant. Naomi watched it collect in tiny rivers down the pane. She remembered rain in Dubai too, rare and sharp, the kind people stopped to watch because it meant something unusual had arrived. Her mother used to love rain. Said it sounded like forgiveness against the roof. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, hearing hospital monitors instead of raindrops, hearing her mother's voice saying the same thing she always said when life got heavy. Integrity costs more than comfort, baby. But it pays better in the end. Naomi opened her eyes and looked at her hands. Same hands that once flipped through $1,000,000 contracts. Same hands now carrying trays. Funny how life could reduce and preserve you at the same time. The kitchen door swung open behind her. Heavy footsteps stopped at the entrance. Naomi did not turn right away. But she recognized the silence before the voice. Came. Richard Whitmore was standing there, no boardroom, no table, no audience. Just a billionaire in a dark suit, standing in the service hallway, looking like a man carrying something heavier than money. Richard Whitmore stood at the doorway of the service kitchen, his dark suit looking out of place against stainless steel counters and stacked trays. Without the long conference table between them, he seemed different. Smaller somehow. Not in size, but in certainty. The sharp edge he carried in the boardroom had dulled into something quieter. Naomi turned slowly, her hands still resting on the metal counter, the sound of rain tapping the small window behind her filling the silence between them. For a moment neither spoke. Richard looked around the kitchen, taking in the narrow aisles, the industrial sink, the racks of clean glasses drying under fluorescent lights. It was a world he had probably never entered, despite owning stakes in hotels like this all over the country. Naomi could see it in his eyes. The realization. How many invisible lives moved around him every day, unnoticed until they mattered. Richard held the broken silver pen in his hand, the one he had snapped in the boardroom. He turned it once between his fingers, then looked at her. "You saved me today," he said. The words were simple, but they landed heavier than she expected. Naomi looked away, wiping her hands on a clean towel out of habit. "I saved your company," she said. Richard nodded once. "Same thing." The rain outside grew stronger, streaking the glass in silver lines. Linda quietly stepped out of the kitchen, sensing the moment did not belong to her. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving only the hum of refrigerators and the steady rhythm of rain. Richard stepped closer, stopping a few feet away. "Why did you speak up?" he asked. Naomi looked at him, surprised by the question. "Because it was wrong." Richard gave a short breath of disbelief, almost a laugh, but without humor. "Do you know how rare that answer is in my world?" Naomi folded the towel neatly beside the tray. "Maybe that is why your world keeps needing saving." The words hit harder than she intended. Richard absorbed them without defense. For the first time in years, he thought about the deals he had signed, the people he trusted, the shortcuts he ignored because profit moved faster than principle. And for the first time, he saw the pattern clearly. Not because his lawyers found it. Because a woman carrying coffee had refused to stay silent. Richard looked down at the broken pen in his hand. "My legal team dug deeper after the meeting," he said. "The Cyprus audit is real. There are 3 open investigations tied to Ethan's subsidiary." Naomi stayed still. She had expected as much. Richard's jaw tightened. "If I signed today, Whitmore Capital would have inherited all of it." Naomi nodded once. "That was the plan." Richard looked at her differently now, not with curiosity, but with respect sharpened by regret. "Do you know what that deal would have done for me?" he asked. Naomi answered honestly. "Made you richer." Richard gave a small, tired smile. "And cost me everything else." Naomi looked at the rain on the window. Her mother used to say greed always sends the bill later. Richard slipped the broken pen into his pocket. "I ran your name," he said. Naomi's eyes moved back to him. "That was fast." "I have fast people," Richard said. "Alnor Capital. Senior Risk Analyst. International Compliance. Top of your division." Naomi looked away. It felt strange hearing her old life spoken aloud in a kitchen where people called her for refills. Richard's voice softened. "Why are you here?" Naomi swallowed. "Because my mother got sick." Richard nodded. No follow-up. No judgment. Just understanding. The kind that comes too late but still matters. He reached into his jacket and placed a white business card on the steel counter between them. Simple. Heavy paper. No gold lettering. Just his name and direct number. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "I want you in my office. Not carrying coffee." Naomi stared at the card, the fluorescent light reflecting off its clean surface. The rain kept falling. The kitchen stayed still. And for the first time in a long time, Naomi Carter felt the future shift beneath her feet. Naomi did not touch the card right away. It sat on the steel counter between them, bright against the cold metal, simple and clean, carrying more weight than paper should. Richard Whitmore stood there waiting, rainwater tapping softly against the small kitchen window behind him, his expression steady but unfamiliar now. Not commanding. Not impatient. Just honest. Naomi looked at the card, then at him. "You are offering me a job?" she asked. Richard nodded. "I am offering you your chair back at the table." The words settled into the room, quiet but sharp. Naomi felt something tighten in her chest. It had been 3 years since anyone looked at her and saw the woman she used to be instead of the uniform she wore now. 3 years of carrying trays, wiping tables, and hearing people talk like she was invisible. Richard glanced toward the rain-covered window, his hands in his pockets now, the boardroom armor gone. "My office starts at 8, he said. "But this is not charity." Naomi lifted her eyes. "What is it, then?" Richard gave a small breath. Correction. That word stopped her. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was rare. Men like Richard were not trained to admit they had measured someone wrong. Naomi looked back at the card. The edges were crisp. Expensive paper. Direct line. No assistant. No gatekeeper. A real offer. But life had taught her something painful. Offers made in emotional moments do not always survive daylight. "And tomorrow?" she asked. "When the headlines hit? When your board asks why you handed trust to a hotel waitress?" Richard looked at her, his face calm. "Then I tell them the truth. A hotel waitress protected my company better than my executive team." Naomi almost smiled, but it faded before it formed. Richard studied her carefully. "What?" he asked. Naomi crossed her arms lightly, leaning back against the counter. "You know what the hardest part was?" Richard waited. Naomi looked past him, toward the empty hallway where the executives had disappeared minutes ago. "Not losing the career." Her voice was softer now. "Not the money. Not even the interviews where people stopped calling back." She paused. "It was becoming easy to believe them." Richard frowned. "Believe who?" Naomi met his eyes. "The people who looked at me and decided my story was over." The kitchen fell still again. The refrigerators hummed. Rain slid down the glass like silver veins. Richard understood then. Not the full weight of it, but enough. How quickly the world turns sacrifice into failure when it cannot see the reason behind it. He reached into his jacket again and pulled out a folded document. Naomi looked at it. "What is that?" "My legal team's preliminary findings," Richard said. He handed it to her. Naomi unfolded it and scanned the page. 3 open investigations. Fraud exposure. Asset inflation. Offshore tax concealment. Ethan Blake had not just built a risky deal. He had built a trap. Richard's voice dropped lower. "He resigned 10 minutes ago." Naomi looked up. "Resigned?" Richard nodded. "Before I could fire him." Naomi folded the paper slowly. Strange how power collapsed. Not loudly. Quietly. One truth at a time. Richard took a step back toward the door. 8 o'clock, he said again. No uniform. Naomi looked at the card one last time. Her reflection shimmered faintly on the steel counter beside it. For the first time in years, she did not see someone surviving. She saw someone returning. Richard opened the kitchen door, but before stepping out he stopped. "Naomi?" She looked up. "Thank you," he said. "Not as a businessman. Not as a billionaire. Just as a man who had almost lost everything because he trusted the wrong voice and nearly ignored the right one. Then he walked out into the quiet hallway, leaving the card behind, and Naomi stood alone with the sound of rain and the feeling that tomorrow might finally remember her name. The rain had stopped by the time Naomi Carter stepped out of the hotel just after midnight. The city felt washed clean, the sidewalks reflecting streetlights and long golden streaks, the air sharp with the smell of wet concrete and cooling asphalt. She stood beneath the awning for a moment, her coat buttoned tight, Richard Whitmore's business card resting in her pocket like something unreal. Behind her, the glass doors of the hotel slid shut with a soft breath, sealing away the noise of silver trays, polished floors, and quiet expectations. For 8 months, she had walked through those doors as someone unseen. Tonight felt different. Not because her uniform had changed, but because the room that once dismissed her had finally heard her. Naomi started walking, her shoes tapping against the damp sidewalk, passing yellow cabs and late-night food carts still steaming under metal lamps. New York moved around her like it always did, fast, indifferent, alive. But tonight she moved differently through it. Slower. Lighter. At the corner of 47th Street, she stopped beneath a red traffic light and looked across the avenue at the reflection of skyscrapers and rainwater gathered along the curb. For a second she saw herself there. Not the waitress. Not the daughter drowning in hospital bills. Not the woman with the empty years on her resume. Just Naomi. Whole. The subway ride home was quieter than usual. A man slept against the window. A woman in scrubs stared at her phone, exhausted from a long shift. A little boy rested his head against his father's shoulder. Ordinary people carrying invisible stories. Naomi understood that now more than ever. When she reached her apartment, the hallway smelled like old wood and radiator heat. Small. Worn. Familiar. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The silence met her first. Her mother's framed photograph still sat on the bookshelf beside the lamp, her smile frozen in time, warm and tired, the way Naomi remembered her in the final months. Naomi placed her keys down and stood there for a long moment, staring at the picture. "You were right," she whispered into the quiet room. "Integrity costs more than comfort. But it pays better in the end." The next morning, sunlight broke through the blinds in pale strips across her floor. At 7:30, Naomi stood in front of her small mirror, adjusting the collar of the navy blazer she had not worn in 3 years. It still fit. A little tighter at the shoulders. But it fit. Her hair was pinned neatly. Her resume sat inside a leather folder, updated late into the night. The same experience. The same mind. Just waiting for the world to see it again. At exactly 8 o'clock, Naomi stepped into Whitmore Capital. The marble lobby gleamed. Under morning light, all steel and glass and polished silence. Different building. Same world she once belonged to. This time, no tray in her hands. No coffee pot. Just her folder and steady steps. At the reception desk, the young assistant looked up. "Name?" Naomi gave a small breath and answered clearly. "Naomi Carter." The assistant checked the screen, then smiled. "Mr. Whitmore is expecting you." As the elevator doors opened, Naomi stepped inside and watched the city rise beneath her through the glass walls. 48 floors. Same height as yesterday. But everything had changed. Upstairs, Richard Whitmore stood in his office by the window, looking over Manhattan with a contract on his desk and an empty chair waiting across from him. When Naomi entered, he turned and gave her a nod. No speeches. No grand gestures. Just respect. Richard pulled the chair out and said, "Take your seat." Naomi sat down, the leather cool beneath her hands, the morning light warming the glass behind her. Outside, the city moved like it always had. But inside that office, in the stillness between them, there was something stronger than power, stronger than money, stronger than pride. Recognition. And sometimes, justice does not arrive with noise. Sometimes it sounds like silence, looks like a chair waiting for the person who earned it, and feels like finally being seen.